Hello, everyone. I'll just do a little bit of talking while we let people into the room. As I kick off with my talking, I'll acknowledge always a great gift when I'm able to speak to you from my own homeland. So I'm here on Mbuntua today as a member of the Mbundurinja belonging to Alice Springs. I acknowledge my ancestors and I acknowledge all the ancestors on the lands in which you come from. Also, your leaders, both those current and those who will emerge with the support of our ancestors. Just wonderful to be able to bring so many voices together. Who'd have ever thought actually we'd be able to do this, talk collectively online through forums like Zoom. Mind you, part of me also thinks once upon a time we probably could have done it even telepathically. But that was a different time when we were able to bring our voices together in a different way. Always a great pleasure to have you in the room. I'm just going to do a quick look at the numbers. 193 in the room. Do we have many left in the waiting room, ladies, secretariat? Right, there's still a few coming on, so I won't talk too much yet until we let them all in. We had 800 registrations today, which is a really good sign because it means everyone's interested in having a conversation. Everyone's interested in learning more. Before we kick off, I'll also acknowledge that sometimes this is a difficult conversation to have. So some of you are going to feel really, really inspired. Some of you might feel a bit triggered. Some of you are curious, and all of those feelings are really, really valid. And it's why we're really delighted to be able to have you in the room to talk about some of those emotions and talk about what's underlying the call for a voice to Parliament, and why SNAICC in particular has been asked to lean into this conversation by both our board and our council. I'll just take a quick look at these numbers. How are we going, ladies? Do we still have more coming in? I think I'm giving the nod. All right, Jim Lob, those of you who've missed the acknowledgement to country, I'm sitting on the lands of my grandfather's family here on Mbuntua as a member of the Mbundurinja. Again, sending my thoughts to all the lands in which you might come from today. I acknowledge all Aboriginal people in the room and all allies, and I also acknowledge that this is going to be an interesting conversation, and am really aware that you're all coming into this room with a level of curiosity. So thank you for joining us, and I hope your ancestors have joined us as well. If you don't know me, my name's Catherine. I'm a Liddle, again, that last name synonymous with Alice Springs. I also have the great pleasure to be the CEO of SNAICC, which is the National Voice for Our Children. I love that. National Voice for Our Children, the peak body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families. I'd like to also make welcome Cara Keys on our webinar today. Hello, Cara. And of course, the webinar is on the voice and the referendum. Cara is a descendant of the Yiman and Gangulu peoples of central Queensland. Cara, I might pause for a minute because I'm not familiar with how to pronounce Gangulu and I might have got it wrong. Did it? Just in case, I'm just pausing to make sure I pronounced the name right.
Correct.
Awesome. Thank you. And Cara is one of the key coordinators with the Voice campaign, working with From the Heart and Yes 23. She has an incredible background in campaigning for the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, whether as part of a union movement or through social justice issues and issues of equity. Cara, again, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to go into a little bit of background about SNAICC and why our sector has asked us to lean into this, in particular our council and our board. So we're holding the webinar to look at the issues around the voice and the referendum and to talk about how it's relevant to the early childhood sector and the child protection sector and child and family services sector, and the potential impact it might have for our families and our communities. We've already had some awesome questions submitted when you registered for today, and we'll get to those soon. Again, if you have more questions, please put them in the chat box. We'll do the best we can to get to them. If we can't, then we'll find a way to circle back to them. This webinar, of course, is on the voice, and it's something that our members have consistently raised with us. They want to know more about this conversation and they want to be engaged in this conversation. And as previously expressed, they want to know why it's relevant in particular to the ECEC sector. These are huge, important questions. So thank you very much for leaning into them and asking them. And certainly this is a conversation, one like we may never have again in our lifetimes, and maybe not even our children's lifetimes. It is an incredibly important question and an important conversation that we all need to be interrogating. At SNAICC, as the national voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families, it's our job as the peak to have these conversations. Our job, of course, was decided 42 years ago by our elders and our families who saw the need to protect, celebrate, and most importantly, change the way our families and children were being treated. Our vision is to see an Australian society in which the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, young people and families are protected, that our communities are empowered to determine their own futures, and that cultural identity is valued. We obviously work with all layers of government and with community to ensure that we're bringing those voices to as many people as possible and amplifying them in any room that we walk into. A large part of that, of course, is ensuring that families, communities and the services that work with our families and communities have all the supports that they need in order to be successful. Because ideally, we'd never have a conversation about our children coming into contact with tertiary interventions, and tertiary interventions, of course, being things like child protection systems, juvenile justice systems, or their parents even having contact with similar systems. I hate that word, system. We do this, of course, because we know, and as all of you on the call today will know, Australia has an horrific track record in its treatment of Aboriginal families and children in particular. We know that feelings and those attitudes towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families and children resulted in policies like the stolen generation and assimilation. Those policies determined at a government level that told our children to be ashamed of who they were, that told our families that they didn't know how to raise their children, despite the fact that we've always had grandmother's law. We've always understood that the strength of community comes through the nurture of our children. We know that this is not an ancient culture, that it is a contemporary culture. It might have been around for 60,000 years, but it continues to grow and it continues to be strong. Our little ones are the only children in Australia, in the world, who have a legacy like this. They're also the only children in Australia who the whole system was built on top of our own ways of knowing, being and doing, those ways that were synonymous with how to work in this country, the only children in Australia to feel that impact. We inherently understand the strength of our communities is grounded in the nurture of our families. And again, you only need to look at the time of colonisation when we had no child protection system because we had grandmother's law. We had no prisons. We didn't need those things. We had other ways of working with our society and our families and our communities. SNAICC, of course, was established to bring that recognition to the forefront, to show what it looks like today, because again, culture continues to evolve and the voice of our people has never been ceded. Our sovereignty has never been ceded. We come into these rooms with the strength of our ancestors. In upholding the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families, we consistently argue that we need to be basing it on our own ways of understanding the world and our own ways of nurturing our children. The push from our communities has always been really, really strong. Some of the strongest wins and biggest wins that we've had relate to lobbying for the Royal Commission into the Stolen Generations, the establishment of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children's Day. Anyone getting ready to celebrate that? We're doing it on Friday. And the development of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Child Placement Principle, with all states and territories committed to implementing. We know that they're not all very good at doing that implementation, but again, that's one of the jobs that we do, is continually test with you as community members. How are they doing on this? How do we make sure that governments are consistent with the commitments that they make to our families? More recently, of course, we've seen the federal government move on our calls to scrap the childcare activity test by extending the hours of subsidised early education and care available to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families. Again, we know the number of hours that we've been able to push for, not quite where we were targeting, but we're confident we can push further as emerging budgets evolve. From July, that means that our children are going to be able to access a minimum of 36 hours of subsidised childcare a fortnight, and that's an increase of 12 hours a fortnight. These reforms, of course, are a step in the right direction. they are not enough, and we need more momentum. We need more grunt. Our driving force, of course, is always to bring that grunt. We know that the majority of our children are living, thriving, and they're healthy and they're happy. But we also know that we have a significant number of children who need a little bit more support, and a significant number of families who need a bit more support. We know that at the heart of that support means that our families have limited access to cultural strengths, because they get interrupted. It's not that they don't know how, it's that system interrupts it. We know that system has things related to it like racism, adverse childhood experiences, and we know that those things compound. Again, we call consistently for the investment into universal quality early childhood care and learning systems, and we believe that funding those types of systems, I don't want to say a system, because it's not how I understand the world. We need to lean into it, because we know that if you really want to reconcile with us, then you appreciate that those early childhood care models are built on our own ways of being. We're hoping that we'll see significant investment into these reforms as we move through the Closing the Gap agreement. But we also know, and anyone who reads the papers or listens to the news on TV, and you know, if you don't, I understand that too. But if you have been tuning in, you'll have heard that the Productivity Commission's had a really big go at all layers of government for not committing to the priority reforms under the national agreement. Those priority reforms that change the way the system was built and embed Aboriginal perspective into policies and priorities and programs and evaluations. It essentially found that what we're looking at isn't our failings. They are the failings of government, and failings of government not meeting their commitments and their agreements, that they're not listening to Aboriginal voices at this point in time, and they're still stuck in a business as usual mode. Our governments at this point in time are too slow to change. They're not bold and they're not brave, and we need them to do this. We need them to be this if we're going to see a massive change in the trajectory for children. This neglect has been going on for too long, and we realise that, and we're tired of having the conversation. We'll never shy away from it, but we know we need something different. We hear a lot from our community members. As you know, we often have these conversations, and the most common question I get asked is, well, what's the practical purpose of a voice to Parliament? What would this mean for our mob when we're still dealing with all of these implications on the ground, when we're still not seeing the big reforms work? How is this going to help us? How would it improve the lives of our families? And again, the Productivity Commission made that very clear. It essentially leaned into the fact that an advisory body informed by the perspectives from our communities, and that's our communities at the grassroots level, would help ensure that all these barriers that all of your mob experience every day are removed, that they're identified, and the practical steps needed to remove them are put in place from an Indigenous perspective. They need to be broken down. What it was showing was that a voice would help inform government about the negative consequences and impacts of policies such as the activity test. Again, if you're not familiar with this activity test, and my gut is most of you would be, everyone screamed that there was something wrong with this policy, and no one listened. Everyone was screaming. We were knocking on doors, and some of those conversations and doors that I walked through were met with responses like, "I'll believe it when I see it. I'll believe it when I see it." And guess what the evaluations showed? The cohort most adversely affected by the activity test was Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. The cohort that is going backwards in the Closing the Gap stats is Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. There is a direct policy line to this decision, and there is a long history of our mob coming into rooms and advocating for change. It basically showed that there has been a significant underinvestment into what we needed and what our children desperately needed. We know that we've never needed a voice more than we needed at this point in time. We know that we need something to budge. If you haven't seen it, we do have a voice statement, and I'm really conscious I've been talking for a long time, and I'd rather throw it open for Cara to start talking to some of the questions. But perhaps if you haven't seen it, it's important that we read it for you now. Our voice, our statement, the one endorsed by our council and our board, reads as such. As the national voice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, SNAICC firmly supports a voice enshrined in the Australian Constitution. We have worked for 42 years to support the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families to have control over their destinies and shape their futures. Despite all our work, our efforts and passion, our children are still removed from family at unacceptable rates. They still lag in school readiness, and the gaps in some cases are widening. These are not our failures. We need to fire the ambitions of all governments, services and leaders to work with us towards a better future for our children and our nation. A voice will light that fire, fueling the work that we do, driving the change that has to happen. The journey towards a referendum is an opportunity for truth-telling, respectful discussions and debates. We, of course, respect that there will be differing views and opinions, but our position as the national peak body is very clear. Our children deserve no less than yes. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to hand over now to Cara to answer some of those questions that you might have been sending in and some of the things you want to understand more about. Cara, the first one up is really simple, and I suspect it's not going to be so simple in answering. And it reads as such: how can we best support our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues over the coming months during the lead up to the referendum, with so many loud voices having a platform that is being used often in a good way and often a not so good way, and often as an opportunity for veiled racism that is sometimes applauded and sometimes publicly supported?
Look, it's a great question, and it is in some respects as simple and complex as changing the Constitution and the reason that we're going to a referendum. I want to reflect for a moment on, that this, like you said, Catherine, this is an extraordinary moment in time. Referendums don't come around a lot, and certainly for Mob, the last referendum on the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people was in 1967. And the last referendum that actually won in this country was in 1977. So they are unusual, complex beasts. The conversations are always that sort of tapestry between complex and simple. Referendums are about principle. And when people are talking about principle, when they're talking about the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, when they're talking about how is the principle of what we're doing in the referendum going to have a practical impact, those are the sorts of, conversations that generally happen when this country goes to a referendum. And I just wanted to sort of, I guess, before I really get into the support bit, but it does go to it, is that whilst this has been triggered by a couple of things in our very contemporary history, which is firstly the Uluru dialogues that ran from 2015 to 2017 and culminated in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which is around voice, treaty and truth as an ambitious kind of process forward in this country. It has been triggered by the fact that the Albanese government won the federal election, and it was a election commitment. I have been involved in this conversation for about 13 years, and we've always been in a if not when, we now have a when, right? In that sort of over a decade conversation. But it's also worth acknowledging that calls for representation, listening, being heard, self-determination has been happening in this country since the 1920s and before from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And certainly not being listened to has had significant impacts generationally on our mob. My mum was a dormitory girl. She was taken away from her family here in Queensland with her sisters, put in an institution to be a domestic. And just that sort of intergenerational impact of not being listened to, the structural ignorance, the willful approach of governments, both state and federally, to the status quo and to the one size fits all and to the detrimental policies and laws that have been made for us do have intergenerational consequences. So in some respects, that kind of how do we look after our colleagues over the coming months is actually a recognition of the weight on our shoulders at this moment in time, because it is an intergenerational weight, not just about our own family and personal experiences, but also about that kind of standing on the shoulders of giants and taking the opportunity to really shape the future for our mob, but also being part of, I guess, shaping the future for the country that we live in. And I think with that weight does come the mental load of having to not only absorb the positive, but absorb the negative that you see now particularly playing out in this campaign, where, you know, I see both light and day working on this campaign. You know, we've got the majority of our field team in the campaign are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people. And, you know, you can tell how it's going out there in the field, because they talk about, you know, is it like a 3 chili spicy kind of day, or is it a 1 chili spicy kind of day? You know, there's great engagement out there. I think there's goodwill amongst the majority of people to have this conversation. But certainly, and particularly now, like, you've got to understand, this is the first referendum we've ever had in the digital age. You know, this is a referendum post-COVID, you know, where there was a lot of anti-vax that is now actually being converted into quite extreme views and commentary around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in this campaign. You know, there is platforming of both. How do we best support our colleagues? I think the first and most important thing is having a wellbeing framework. We certainly have one on the campaign. Like I said, we've got a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people working for us, but also allies who racism affects them in a very different way, but it still affects them. And I think setting up, setting up some wellbeing frameworks, understanding first and foremost where you're at, but then also looking out for your team, understanding that the effects of racism are a traumatic and triggering experience for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is really important. And then, you know, understanding, I think, like, what are the markers of your stress and where are you going with that and where's your well-being at? And always being, you know, available to people to have a conversation is really important, and being proactive. Like, understand that right now, if you're really feeling the conversation, as my team would say, is getting really spicy, and it is, and it will get more spicy. What we are recommending to our people in terms of how do we all support each other and how do you support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people you're working with is encouraging people to be quite proactive around their own mental health and the team's culture and health and wellbeing as well.
Whoops, thank you, Cara. You know, thinking about the spiciness, it's a very positive way of framing it, actually. But I was getting my coffee this morning, and like many people on the call here today, you know, we do carry significant trauma in our family relating to the stolen generation and the stories of our grandfather. And you know, I think it's the convalescence of all of these conversations, and the fact that these conversations that are so important to us and so deeply held to us are now the fodder for everyone. And it's a really tough landscape. And I was thinking about that old man and some of the stories he used to tell us. And he never talked about the dark stuff. He was very, very brave. And it wasn't really until he was diagnosed with cancer and they did all the scans that they found that, you know, he'd been living in pain pretty much from about the age of 5, which is when they found that every single one of his lower vertebrae had been shattered. And until that point in time, to be perfectly honest, I'd heard that expression, kicked up the bum, or kicked up the arse, as people say. I'd never actually realised that people would do that to a child. And it was at that point you realise how horrific, you know, you've always known it's horrific, but when he'd talked to us about crying himself to sleep at night and crying for his mother every night, he would have also been crying in pain that he'd been abused so badly that his lower vertebrae, every single one of them, shattered, and yet he still had to function. And what he would tell us as growing up was, don't be afraid. When you're going to sleep at night, don't be afraid, which was always inconsistent with what our Nana would say, which was be terrified because Mum was going to get you. But Grandpa would say to us, do not be afraid of what you cannot see. There is nothing out there that can hurt you. I think for me, what resonates in that is for you as someone who carries the key messages of this campaign, how do you just synthesize that? What are the key messages that people need in order to feel safe at this point in time? What is the campaign telling us?
I think that's a really important question. And I want to step through in a sort of structured way why. And I want to start with, when we're talking about safety in the campaign, there's a critical piece of research that we did that basically says that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need to feel safe having the conversation, and generally non-Indigenous people feel awkward talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues, right? So that's I guess from a messaging point of view, something that we have certainly taken into consideration, because what you do want to do is create safe spaces for respectful discussion. And even if you're having a conversation with someone who doesn't agree with you, how do you have a safe and respectful discussion? And really, from a messaging point of view, to create that sort of safety and overcome the awkwardness, the message is very, very simple. It is, what we are doing at this referendum is acknowledging that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been here for 60, 65,000 years. It's the recognition piece, that we recognise that, and the very complex but rich tapestry of our country. Yeah. So that's quite simple. Like, it's recognition. Have blackfellas been here? Has there been this continuous culture for 65,000 years? And then the second part of the referendum, which is also very simple, is, should we listen to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people around the matters and the laws and policies that directly affect them? And both of those things are in the change to the Constitution that the referendum is seeking. And it is actually as simple as that. So the messaging needs to be simple. And then there's this sort of overcomplication of something that, yes, is significant, and our issues are complex. But what we're asking the Australian people is very simple. Do we recognise and do we listen?
Thank you, Cara. I was thinking about how we root that into the current environment for our mob, and again, if I apply it to, say, the Closing the Gap agreement and the new and the original Closing the Gap targets. Again, those targets relating to early childhood education and care weren't there. Basically, what we had was a target that said if all children have access to preschool, then all children will succeed, they'll thrive. And at that point in time, again, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people said there's something wrong. There's something wrong with how you've analysed this. And again, all of you on the line who work in early childhood education and care will know very well that preschool is not the determinant. It is access to really culturally strong quality early education and care services, those ones built by our families. And if we don't have them built by our families, then ones that acknowledge our strengths so that our children not only have everything they need to succeed once they hit preschool, but also are culturally strong enough to walk into worlds that for the very first time, they will not be supported by their families when they walk through those doors on. And again, it took 10 years in order for us to shift the policy settings so that governments were putting the dollars into the right spot, and we're still pushing in. It takes a long time. So getting back to why it's important for children, a lot of our services at this point in time are telling us that not only are they having families ask about this, but they also, families are saying, well, what do we talk to our kids about? Because there's a lot of noise out there at this moment in time. What's the best way to carry that message for children?
Well, I think it is keeping it simple, keeping it really simple. the way that I'm expressing, it's really simple. It's recognition and listening, right? The first time I ever heard that was not from some messaging expert who, the government have picked up that messaging now, is actually from my son. Like he was like, it just seems so simple, Mum. Like, why wouldn't we do this? So I do think it's about keeping it simple, but I also think rooting it in that cultural struggle. I was saying when I first opened up, like our generation now are literally standing on the shoulders of giants in terms of the calls of across decades. And I think this can be like a really great learning. It's certainly something I've spoken to my son about. Like, this is a passing of the baton, and now it's Mum's turn, and then one day it's going to be your turn. And I do think that there's a beauty in that for our mob, and in terms of how we talk to our kids about what is, like, for a kid, probably like, they would have 1,000 questions, including what is the Constitution? And then how do you explain that to a kid? Well, it's the rule book for the nation. 1,000 kids about how the government, 1,000 questions about how the government works and what it all means. But there is a way to really break that down simply, but then also root it in our history and about who we are and the continuation of the journey, really. And that, the voice is not going to be the silver bullet, but it then gives us something to work from, and we will be heard.
I always lean into that silver bullet because we know they're designed to kill werewolves, and what we're talking about is significantly more complex than that. But I want to lean into a little bit about what you were talking about there. I was, I often wonder if, and because I don't have any experience outside my own experience and my own family's experience, but I go for a run in the morning and I pull into Woolies and I get my food for the day. And without fail, if I see another Aboriginal Torres Strait person, they want to pull up and talk about politics. I'm not sure, is that normal or is that just the world that we live in? But one of those conversations related, it was like this. And she said, you know what, I'm getting really tired of being asked if my family in the bush understand the Constitution. I want to say to people, go and ask your grandmothers. Go and ask your grandmothers if they know what's in the Constitution, and then let's come back and have a conversation. And I thought to myself, well, that's a really simple way of looking at it. And because I'm always consistently, and I'm sure all of you on the line are consistently looking at ways to get through noise, get through how I might feel triggered, because a lot of these conversations, like anybody else, trigger me, and there's a journey that we all take on these conversations. And I know it's not a massive mental health tip, but one of the ways I do it is to go and look at our comedians. Geez, we got some funny people. And even though, he doesn't lean into this particular conversation, I tell you what, if I really need a good laugh because the day's been so heavy and I need to push something away, I go and look at Isaac Compton. He makes me laugh without fail because he takes on really hard conversations and then sees the funny side and the resilient side of it. But I don't know if that's how it works for everyone. But I've also got a question here that is from a person who is non-Aboriginal. And what they've said is, as a non-Aboriginal person working in the early years services and run by an ACO, is it respectful for me to share information about the Yes campaign with Aboriginal people? I can see how that would be conflicting.
I can absolutely see how there is what I was talking about before about the awkward piece for our allies, for non-Indigenous people. And certainly I think is it respectful? I think it's respectful to have a conversation, absolutely. I think if there are differences of opinion, that's okay. If you're sharing material in the sense of you support it and you'd like to have a conversation, I don't feel like that's any different, to be honest, than sharing information with non-Indigenous people, because this conversation has to be a national conversation. It has to be between, neighbours, your co-workers, at your community clubs, amongst your family. Yes, the outcome of the referendum is about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and the voice, importantly, is about the practical effects that come after it, the listening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, on the matters that affect them. And I do get asked versions of this question quite a lot. I must say it is a common theme. And the bigger response to that question is that this is as much about the past and the future of your country as it is about ours. You know, recognising that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the longest continuing culture and modern culture with ancient roots in the world is as much about the tapestry of your country as settlers as it is about your future, because this referendum is going to say something about who Australia wants to be. So should you be an active participant in that conversation? Absolutely. If someone disagrees with you, do you have respectful conversations and safe spaces? Yes. But you don't, you know, the awkwardness is okay, but understand that this is just as much about who we want to be as a country going forward for our non-Indigenous allies and non-Indigenous Australians.
You know, how do you, and again, I mean, it's a little bit circular, so I apologise, Cara, but in when someone is having one of those difficult conversations, and these are conversations you might have to have, you know, you do need to explore this. You know, one of the ones I was looking at the other day online was talking about, and you wonder how this gets through, but then I realised, you know, there is no legislation to stop people from misinformation. Again, you can pretty much say whatever you want. This one related to if the voice gets through, it's a way of mining companies being able to dump nuclear waste without being, you know, as a free-for-all. When you're having conversations that might go down paths as tricky as that one, when, you know, again, it's about Aboriginal people having a voice, not about mining companies being able to dump nuclear waste. How do you navigate through that in a straight line?
Well, those sort of conversations, I would say, are never a straight line. They're much more like zigzaggy, right? Like when you're running from a croc, you never run in a straight line because you're going to get caught. You're just running that zigzag. So I actually think the way to deal with that, because that is misinformation and disinformation, and there is a lot of lies and hateful rhetoric coming from certain sections of society, and then that is feeding into people thinking about that and believing it. So I actually feel like the best way to approach that conversation is with really open questions, which is, where did you hear that? Where did you hear that from? How did you find that out? Tell me a bit more about why you think that's the case. And then actually that opens up into a conversation around what is mis and disinformation and what are the facts of what the referendum is about.
I'm also conscious that I've been asking a lot of questions, and again, you're a person that's been asked a lot of questions. So is there anything in what I'm asking you that I've missed? Is there something you're going, geez, Catherine, I really wish you'd asked me this question?
Look, not particularly, because I think, you know, we are at that part of the campaign where, you know, asking and answering questions is such an important, like having the yarn, having the conversation is so critical at this stage of the campaign. We are expecting to go to the referendum. If I put money on it, I would say October. But that's only because, right, what happens in the Northern Hemisphere and at the end of October, the wet season.
Yeah.
You cannot have a referendum about mob in the wet season, right? So that's just my, like, you know, armchair analysis, but also obviously that's baked in with a whole bunch of political and campaigning experience that I've had. But if you just look at when the wet season starts, you cannot disenfranchise communities that are voting on their own rights. Yeah. So I'm going to say October. So at this stage of the campaign, we're, you know, 10, 12 weeks away from going to a referendum. Having the conversation is really, really important. But also a lot of questions that I do get asked, and this sort of goes to like general questions that the community is saying about the referendum, like, oh, well, we need more detail, you know, what we're finding is that a lot of people don't understand referendums, right? We haven't had one in this country for a very long time. They're actually very different to a general election, right? So this is not like a normal federal or state election. You know, it's not really a political party election. You know, normally in a general election, you know, you've got one party in one colour and the other party in the other colour and maybe a couple of other different colours, and they're all picking off marginal seats, and then they get those marginal seats and they're the ones that they try and win to form government, right? So a referendum is not that. It's not a 51-49. A referendum is a double majority. It's an extremely high benchmark to win a referendum. Double majority is 50% of the country and then 50% of the states. The Northern Territory and the ACT are not counted in the state count at all. They only contribute to the national majority. So it is extremely high benchmark to win a referendum. It's much easier for the no side to win than it is for the yes side. That sort of what is the straight line to victory is a lot more complex for people who want a referendum to succeed than it is for those who would like to see it fail. It's just a pure numbers game, right? No only have to win, you know, maybe not the national majority doesn't win. 3 states.
I was thinking about, again, some of the campaigning that we have seen from the no side in recent months. And, you know, I live in Alice Springs, and let's be honest, we've got some real big issues that we need to be dealing with here on the ground. But again, as someone who's worked in Indigenous engagement and voice-related topics for a very long time, I've also seen what happens every time we get some traction. There's a policy change, and that policy change is either related to a change in minister or a change in government. And those programs that might be getting success wiped out overnight, and all the money recalled and then redistributed to the priorities of the next government.
Absolute political football.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that political football piece, and again thinking about because this SNAICC is inherently children based, and then I was thinking about how we sustained 4 months of conversation relating to children, you know, national conversation about the need to dismantle the Aboriginal child placement principle. And those of you on the line who have been actively engaged in advocating for this particular piece of legislation, because it is inherently tied to our children's rights and is inherently tied to getting better outcomes for our children. I look at it and I think, what happens? What happens if this fails? And we're hearing that now at the national level, the removal of the Aboriginal child placement principle, despite all evidence that shows that it's significant. Again, are the stakes higher, Cara, than we realise?
I think the stakes are incredibly high. Yeah, absolutely. Are they higher than we realise? I mean, I think the conversations that I have with mob is that they understand the significance of the referendum and the significance of the change that it could make to their lives, their industry, the sector that they work in. I think people are already thinking positively about the change, you know, like when we've got the voice, positively thinking about, you know, how their industry or sector could have improvements with a constitutionally enshrined voice. But yes, I do think the stakes are incredibly high. And I think that that's both from a practical sense, but when I think about the no side, when I think that I have not heard any positive alternatives from them, that, you know, that they politicize our community. They have definitely politicized your community for the sake of their opposition to this referendum. They use political rhetoric and they don't offer a positive alternative to this. So when I think about that, I think about, well, what is their vision for my son? Because I have a positive vision for my son and my mob going forward. You know, what is positive vision for all of our Djadjams. Like, we have one through this voice campaign, through the referendum. We have a positive vision for our Djadjams through Voice Treaty Truth, but I don't see that from them. And I think that is what actually makes the stakes higher.
I was thinking again, if I root it again, it's easier for me to talk from my own experience.
Yeah.
But here in Alice Springs, we had a debate a few years ago about the flying of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander flags on top of Anzac Hill. So Anzac Hill is known colloquially as, you know, the War Memorial, but for us mob, it's also one of the most significant sacred sites for women, but also Caterpillar hides. You know, when he's been looking for war, he hides, he slides down. So there are significant stories affected as attached to that particular site. And all of them, actually, believe it or not, there is a level of battle related to it. But the No campaign for flying that flag as the only war memorial in Australia not to have an Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander flag flying on it was based in the fact that if you flew it, we would see a divided community, that it was divisive, and would set up two tiers of community, one for the blacks and one for the whites, by flying a flag on top of Anzac Hill. And I think this relates to one of the questions in the chat there, and it says, if you know it's a lie, shouldn't you be direct?
Yes, I think you should. But you can be, you know, my view around this particular national conversation and the referendum is that you can be direct, but I like to come to that conversation with as much positivity and respect as possible. I think that's what we have, that the no opposition don't. They do lie. They lie willfully, and sometimes their vilification is quite horrific. But countering that with creating respect and positivity is my view. So yeah, call it out, absolutely. But you know, when they go low, we go high, to be frank.
Yeah. What about the bureaucracy piece? We hear that as well, that it creates another layer of bureaucracy. And I look at it like, again, as a peak, we've got to go in and be able to consult with people at speed. Something's happening. How do we get your voices together? And when I look at it, and again, it is yet to be determined by our communities what the genuine shape of it will be. But I think I've got to get in there and do a consult. There's the voice. There it is, already elected. We can talk to the right people at the right time in the right environments. So how do we respond to, and what is the explanation when people say, I've got a concern that really all that's going to happen is we've got another layer of bureaucracy, and we all know bureaucracy slows things down?
Yeah, look, it is a common question that people have. You know, it's going to create another layer of bureaucracy. It'll slow things down. So there's kind of like two ways to respond to this. That is actually something that has been completely dispelled by a range of High Court judges, ex-politicians like Fred Chaney, who was a Liberal politician and the Aboriginal Affairs Minister under Malcolm Turnbull, who said he had a body like The Voice, but it wasn't constitutionally enshrined, and it was the best governance piece that he's ever worked with, because he knew we could go straight to them, knew who to talk to, the right people from the right industries, the right representatives from the right regions, etc. And it actually sped up governance and decision-making. So there's a range of different people who have experience in this who are saying, actually, The Voice will make things faster, more efficient, and actually better governance, not just for the government of the day, but for the bureaucracy, and also, and also for communities. The secondary thing about this sort of, there'll be more bureaucracy. At the moment, we have a situation where billions of dollars are spent on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs in this country. And we saw it in the Productivity Commission report last week. And we've seen it before in previous Productivity Commission reports, that only 30% of that money is getting to the grassroots, to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So if anything, having the voice and being able to make good, well-informed, quick decisions, responsive decisions to the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and making sure that that money gets down to community will actually reduce bureaucracy. That's the interesting thing about the argument of, oh, bureaucratic layers and slowing things down. Actually, there's billions of dollars being wasted on bureaucracy, and this will make bureaucracy and governance better.
I was thinking about that because one of the things that one of the conversations that sparked, and again, as part of that, were related to the dollars. And I think there was that comment relating to $30 billion being spent on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs. And again, getting back to the honesty in these conversations, anyone who knows anything about the data sets knows that that formula is actually based on every hospital, every school, regardless of how many Aboriginal students attend it, every submarine ever built, every road ever laid. They are the stats that go 3% of all of the expenditure across Australia is attributed to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, as directly opposed to what it actually is spent in direct funding, and that is the programs and services that our families need. Again, it's probably not a surprise to the child protection sector who might be on the line here, that $6 billion that goes into a system designed to remove children, 16% of that $6 billion goes into early prevention and intervention programs. And of that, a fraction hits the community controlled sector. Most of that, and again, most of the numbers associated with child protection actually sit with non-Indigenous organisations. So it is a really, really complicated conversation. What I'm wondering is it how, and this is a really good one. And again, this is where it gets hard for a lot of people on the ground in having these conversations and how they lean in to support it. We've got two intersecting pieces here, Cara. One says, how do we support our non-Indigenous, how do we support our First Nations colleagues if it doesn't go through? And the other one is around, well, how is there a role for early childhood organisations to publicly show support for the Yes campaign? I know they're two edges of a different argument, but I know we're running close to time, so I wanted the opportunity to apply to both.
Yeah. Okay, no problems. I want to be able to actually just bring in that last question because it around equality and that getting around in this debate, because I think it's really important to then frame up the sort of two edges, right? So this sort of idea that this is all Australians are equal before the law goes to the complexity that Catherine was just talking about, right? Which is, we know that we are not equal before the law because the voice is actually about structural change, because the structures are actually stacked against mob, right? The law might apply theoretically equally, but this is actually about systemic and structural reform to address equity. Yeah, that's what this is about. So if you think about all the things that you're trying to do and the work that you do, those are things that you're trying to do which create structural reform. And this is a big structural reform that is about the future of our country, but also about the future of, making advancements for our mob, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and our children and the children that you work with. So should you support it? Is there value in early childhood education centres in supporting the campaign? Absolutely. And I think the most important reason is for the kids, so there's two in my view, for the kids that attend the centres, the kids that are engaging in early childhood. I think having these conversations very early, them understanding that you're a safe space for our mob is really important, in that you're supporting this change. But obviously, you guys are the gateway to these kids' families. If you show that you're supporting it and someone says, I don't know anything about that, what is that about? It's an opportunity for a conversation. And in my view, that's how we win this, right? We win this through conversations. And a lot of the time that is peer-to-peer, family to family, at your sporting clubs, at your barbecues, however whoever you are outside of work and inside of work, it's the conversation, being confident, and then making someone go, oh, okay, yeah, that's really simple. I can support that. Because you do hear a lot like, oh, you know, Aboriginal people haven't heard of it. Well, you know what? Neither has most of the Australian population yet, right? Like people are disengaged. They haven't heard about it. So we need to be having those yarns. And you publicly supporting the campaign is incredibly important for those yarns.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, I was going to say, in order for that to happen, people obviously need to be able to access some resources because, as you said, it's a complicated conversation for anyone who wants to have it. How do they make it simple and where do they go?
So yes23.com.au, you will find all the information you need. There's also like very plain English versions of the material. They're very easily printable, high res, but black and white. So you don't have to color print. They still look amazing. So there's a range of different resources and information on the website. And you can also access our shop. What I'll do after this, Catherine, is I will send over a code to you. And that means that people can go to the shop, buy core flutes, posters, all of that sort of material. And for community-based organisations, we give them a code and you get it at cost price, like a community price that you can then buy materials if you would want to do those. Or I would suggest like get the printed materials and then get the kids to make the posters. Like some of the most cool campaign content that I have seen so far is when kids are putting their artistic creativity into their expression for voting yes. You know, it could be chalk on a pavement. It could be, you know, beautiful posters or banners or walls, you know, like we did this project in South Australia where a whole bunch of kids came out and just painted this wall, you know, like, so I just think, you know, there are other ways that you can do that and also get the kids involved. I do want to answer the other spectrum of that question, which is how do we support First Nations people if it goes down, if it's not supported? I don't actually like to think about not winning. Like I'm an experienced enough campaigner to understand what it means, but I will tell you that there is a path to victory here. You know, the conversations that we're having with everyday Australians are diametrically different to what you're hearing in the media. There is a path to victory here. If you just listen to the media, they are gaslighting us into thinking that the Australian population is not going to vote for this, and it's simply not true. It's not what our numbers are telling us, and it's not what the conversations we're having every day, every week, every month on the street are telling us. I don't like to think about losing, but it would be devastating. And I think that would need to be a very, I think the conversation post-referendum and how you support people after it would need to be something that takes in mental health, well-being, cultural safety, and to be honest, quite a serious framework approach to that.
Thank you, Cara. We pretty much are at time. That's been a fantastic conversation. Anything that we haven't answered in the chat, we will get back to you on. I was thinking about, again, simplifying it because again, one of the things that I see in my news feed is negative story after negative story after negative story. I am a media specialist, and this is what I know. Media creates stories that they think you will open. I also know that for every positive Aboriginal story, and this has been from time immemorial, you can expect at least 5 negative stories because that's the way it goes. We get traction, in come the ones that really get traction, and they tend to be negative stories. And I personally was feeling the weight of that, and I talked to one of my colleagues about it, and I said, how do I see through this? How do you keep your head up when we're having such really fundamental conversations? And again, an opportunity once in a lifetime. And the way it was centered for me was to say, at the end of the day, Australians are going to have to go into a booth and be asked whether or not they support a voice for Parliament. He said, I suspect most Australians, when they're actually faced with saying, no, we don't think you need one, are not going to be able to vote no.
I think that's right.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, Cara. It's been a pleasure. Reach out to your mob if you need help. We're always happy to be here for you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.